This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Welcome back, everyone, to World to Win. I'm Toya here with my co-host Yaara, and today we're going to be talking about the socialist fight against the far right in Italy and Brazil, and maybe throw in a little bit about some other countries around the world. Just for a disclaimer, we are filming this before you're watching it, so there's a rapidly changing situation, and so some things may have progressed. But I think the guests that we have today and the questions that we're going to ask are going to give a great overview of the situation and kind of point the way forward as socialists, what we're calling for. So before we get into it, I just want to say hello to Yaara. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. It's flannel season now that it's November, so I'm very excited. But let's get started because we have a lot to talk about today. There's so much going on. I'm especially excited to talk about what's going on in Brazil because I've been paying very close attention. I live in a state with a lot of Brazilian immigrants, so it's been on the minds of many people in my neighborhood. But looking around the world today, it could be easy to draw actually a pessimistic conclusion about the direction of politics. I mean, in a significant number of countries, the far right have seemed to, have wind under their sails and they're gaining ground. Earlier this year, we saw Marine Le Pen in France grew her vote in the presidential elections, and the Swedish Democrats, a party with neo-Nazi roots, which sounds weird because of their name, are now the second largest party in Sweden. And that's not to mention the developments in the US, for example, where we've got, Trump supporters who remain firmly in control of the Republican Party, and they continue to wage assaults on women, queer people, and people of color. I mean, we just saw recently an attack at the home of Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House. She's like the third most powerful woman in the country. And they attacked her husband, and the members of the Republican Party were mocking him. And it was obvious that the person attacking her attacking her husband was there to kidnap her. And it's just a really scary situation of how emboldened the right has become and how they're attempting to normalize this type of violence. What do you think, Yaara?
Yeah, we're recording this actually the day after the election in the Israeli state, and the far right is definitely emboldened there as well. Actually, the main far right party has become the third largest party in the country, which is significant because we have quite a lot of parties. And it's been, a huge campaign with Netanyahu kind of in the last election, which wasn't that long ago, it was like a year ago. But Netanyahu in the last election was saying that he's not going to sit with the far right in coalition, and now it was kind of pushed to the point where he has to say that he would, and he even, he kind of said that he would sit with them, and now they've gained quite a lot of seats in parliament, which is quite frightening. That the kind of entire manifesto is all about going back to like religious law and attacking Palestinians and having the state of Israel from the river to the sea. So it's genuinely frightening, but obviously there's also attacks from them on LGBT rights and women's rights. But interestingly enough, because of the support that they got from Netanyahu, they had to kind of pretend like they're becoming more moderate. They kind of took back some of the things that they previously said, but we all know that it's just, a facade. So it's a really interesting situation and really frightening one. And, I think we're seeing in the US like Trumpism and like the other examples that you gave as well. So it looks like there's such a rise of the far right in so many places. So I think it's going to be really interesting to talk about, two countries that had kind of a very different result in their elections this time. But at the end of the day, I think that the root of all of these issues, the root of the rise of the far right, is what we're going to talk about, and is very similar around the world because it comes out of, a global issue.
Absolutely. And I mean, speaking about the two countries that had different results, starting with Brazil, we had Lula, who won and was always the favorite to win. Bolsonaro, who's the incumbent, surprised everyone with just how he managed to close the gap. And in the end, we saw Lula won by it was actually a really close election, just 2 million votes, which is just barely above 50% to 49%. Although Bolsonaro may no longer be president, it's clear that he's not going away, or, his supporters, like Bolsonaroism, as we say, with like Trumpism, is not going away. He's managed to consolidate tons of support. We're seeing, his supporters in over 300 cities blocking streets, calling for him to remain in power or to, continue on with his legacy.
Yeah, and we're seeing obviously in Italy the rise. The party that won the election is a party with actual roots in fascism. We've seen even the prime minister was active in an organization that was actually started from support for fascism. And we're also seeing in the areas that they already have support, the attacks, especially on women's rights, but on refugee rights as well. But we're seeing them already preparing to do that on a national level. So I'm really curious to see what our guests are going to say about this, because I feel like everyone's been watching these countries, especially in the context of the far right. So first of all, we've got Eugenio here, who is an ISA member from Italy. How are you doing, Eugenio?
Very well, Yaara. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
And you also have Pedro from ISA in Brazil. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
Pedro, let's start with you. I want to get talking about Brazil because, like I said, I've been watching this race very closely. I'm wondering if you could, talk a little bit about some of the key takeaways from this election, and why actually did Bolsonaro do so much better than many people had initially anticipated?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned already, the results were extremely tight, both in the first round and in the second round, actually. And it's a reflection on how polarized the scenario is at the moment. So in the first round, Bolsonaro did much better than was indicated in the polls, which he went up almost 10 points further than what people were expecting, and that already was a shock, even if there was 6 million votes separating him and Lula, who came out in front in that first round. But even in the second round, we saw was actually closing of the gap, as you said before, to just only a difference of 2 million votes. So it's extremely tight, extremely polarized situation, and the reasons for this, there is a number of factors. I think one of the questions is that even though it confirmed, Bolsonaro was defeated, and this is a major victory for the working class and oppressed people in Brazil, we can't underestimate that, which is something also that affects the world. But it just proved that Bolsonaro will be a factor and is not something that will just go away instantly. And he was able to strengthen his base throughout this campaign, was able to use a different combination of measures and methods to raise his support. So gaining support from part of his evangelical base, for evangelical churches, and a network of pastors that would use their positions to support him during the campaign. Also with right-wing mayors and other politicians around the country, which we also used what we call the secret budget, which was a transfer of money to municipalities in exchange for support as well. But also a huge barrage of fake news that was constantly being streamed using social media platforms, especially things like WhatsApp and Telegram, which was spread across to build up fears of the left, of those the things we've heard in the United States and other places as well, like the threats of communism and things like this, which are unfounded with a PT government, and but also this unprecedented use of the state machine. So using everything he had in his power as president, and doing things like anticipating benefits for the poorest layers, anticipating benefits also for part of his base, so for like truck drivers with subsidies and other measures that helped flood like the voters with more money and more and influence them in that way. But at the same time as well, we saw the role of the majority of the left and the workers' government, the PT, not taking the initiative and not taking the struggle to the streets. You know, they let Bolsonaro basically control the streets during the electoral campaign with protests and mobilizations. And the PT, on the other hand, had a very timid street campaign, very limited campaign on the actual streets, only really started mobilizing people in the second round because of the fear of Bolsonaro winning. So it was a number of measures, including even voter suppression that was used on the day of voting as well, that helped Bolsonaro close this gap and show that he is still a factor and will be a factor during the next few months and few years.
And I think, you know, when we're seeing it, it felt like a few months ago was like a clear landslide victory for Lula. And seeing him close this gap is actually genuinely quite scary. But I know that I was refreshing the news every 5 seconds to see what's up, because it was so close. It was like watching some kind of race for real. But yeah, I think it's terrifying to see, you know, how strong the base of support of the far right is. And I think comparing and contrasting it to the establishment figures that we're seeing around the world, who people are voting for as like a lesser evilism, but not from genuine support, is kind of showing this need for an alternative. You know, like similarly in Israel, there's been a government of change after the last election that was trying to get rid of Netanyahu. Let's not talk about the fact that the government of change was also a far-right government in essence. But I had kind of like this weird coalition of loads of different parts of the political spectrum in the country, and it's clearly failed so much because there has been kind of like a landslide victory, at least at this point, from the votes to Netanyahu. But I want to move on to Italy, because I think it's really kind of like, it goes really well as a segue from this, because I think a lot of people are asking why, kind of like, how did we get to this point in a country like Italy? We've discussed on Well to Win before a lot how the far right aren't, you know, kind of like detached people that just fell from the sky and they were just, you know, accidentally were gaining support, but kind of a product of a profound crisis of capitalism. And I think that this discontent that we're seeing around the world from the crisis, and as the crisis progresses, we're seeing also the far right gaining more traction, is really crucial. Like, people are seeing the status quo and they want to get rid of it, and the alternative that they have seems to be the far right. So can you tell us a little bit, Eugenio, about what brought kind of the rise of the Brothers of Italy?
Yes, so, well, if we want to understand the rise of the Brothers of Italy today and in reality the general political crisis that Italy is undergoing, we need to understand the crisis of Italian capitalism that Italian capitalism has been going through for at least the past 2 decades. Italy is the third largest economy in Europe. It has been for a long time one of the key economic powers in Europe, despite it not being reflected as strongly in its international position. But it is a country that has been one of the hardest hit, maybe only after Greece and some other countries of Eastern Europe, from the successive crises that have plagued Europe and the world. And I think plagued is a very appropriate term, actually, over the last few decades. It's a country that the Italian economy never recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. The GDP, the Italian GDP, never reached the levels of the same level of economic growth, and in reality the same level of the period before the 2008 crash, and that had a profound impact on the ability of Italian capitalism to respond to the subsequent crisis to which it was confronted. And this, of course, reflected itself on the political level. Italy, because this economic and social crisis that gripped the country in 2008 and afterward came already at the time where the Italian political scenario was had completely collapsed. At the end of the 90s, Italy went through its largest political crisis in history, where we even talk about the end in reality of the First Republic and the beginning of the Second Republic, but that in reality was a complete transformation of the political scene based on the collapse of the traditional parties, both of the ruling class, with the collapse of the Christian Democrats under the myriad of scandals of corruption and embezzlement and other various criminal charges, but also the collapse of the organizations of the working class, with the collapse of the Communist Party, which was at the time still at the time the largest communist party in Western Europe, and the impact that this had throughout the labor movement and throughout Italian society. So to get back a bit closer to today, how Brothers of Italy specifically came to power? Well, it did so on the ashes of all other political forces that are currently present in Italian society. Brothers of Italy is actually the only party that, at least in the last few governments, has not come to power. In particular, it distinguished itself during the pandemic and in the period after the pandemic by being the only party in parliament in the opposition to the Draghi government, which was a large coalition government made up of all the establishment parties around the figure of the former president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, which was meant, again, to be a government of national unity, an emergency government of national unity, to try and tackle the crisis of Italian capitalism, manage the crisis of Italian capitalism, and especially by allocating the funds given to Italy by the European Union in the Next Generation EU plan and the Recovery Fund, with Italy being the largest receiver of European subsidies. In the face of the European subsidies in this period of crisis. So we really need to understand, if we want to understand how Brothers of Italy came to power, we really need to understand in reality the failure of all other political forces to properly tackle and to properly to govern in reality the country and to manage the interests of the Italian capitalist class, but also the desperation. The desperation and fear that this inability of the ruling elite to properly manage the country and to properly face the multiple crises that are confronting Italy is pushing towards the need for more radical forms of government, such as under the form that will take the new far-right government of Brothers of Italy, of Fratelli d'Italia.
You mentioned a little bit about kind of the how strong the left was in Italy before, and I was wondering if you think that how it became less strong also had an impact on the way that Brothers of Italy have risen.
Yes, certainly. The void the political void that was left by the collapse of the Communist Party and by in reality the retreat of the labor movement from the political scene is something that has scarred the Italian political scene ever since the late 90s, and especially since the late 2000s, when the new left formations that came out of the collapse of the Communist Party also began to fade away under the pressure of under the pressure of their integration within the Italian political system. But so there is, and certainly this void has in reality left a space in the Italian political context in which working people, young people, and especially young people, do not see themselves represented by the political institutions and by the political forces that are currently running the country. It is, in fact, a recent poll that was taken before the elections showed that less than 65%. That more than 65% of the Italian population does not have little to no trust in the political institutions of the country, and 9 out of 10 and from another poll, 9 out of 10 people, especially young people between 18 and 35, do not trust any political force that is currently present in Italy, and this is something that was reflected very strongly in the elections as well, because we need to remember that while the right wing coalition led by Fratelli d'Italia, by the far right, got the most votes, it also did so in the least participated election in the history of the Italian Republic. So since the fall of fascism and the end of World War II. So it is this mistrust, and this lack of political engagement that it persists in Italy is certainly a reflection in reality of that failure of the left and of the left to reorganize itself in the period following the collapse of Stalinism and to present a real alternative to the neoliberal project and to the neoliberal project, to austerity and to the crisis of capitalism.
Yeah, this seems to be a theme that we have where there's a huge connection between the rise of the right and a lack of transparency, mobilization, and a lack of fighting for working class policies from the left. We see it here in the US with Trump and his supporters still claiming that the election of Joe Biden in 2020 was fraudulent, that, he didn't really win the election. And we see it also in Brazil with Bolsonaro and his supporters making ridiculous claims about Lula and the PT, the Workers' Party there. So Pedro, can you talk a little bit about what, our criticisms actually are of Lula? Because just because the right wing makes ridiculous claims doesn't mean that there aren't valid criticisms from the left of his previous presidency, and also what can this teach us about what to expect in the coming years?
Yeah, so Lula was elected the first time in 2002 and had 2 terms as president during that time. And I think the major feature, and probably our major criticism of his time in government, was that it was a government of class conciliation. So the idea that somehow you can organize together and bring together in the form of negotiations or deals or anything, the interests of the ruling class with the working class. And during that time, he did do some, which was important, but very limited social reforms, with expanding benefits to the poorest classes, opening more universities, but still in an extremely limited way. So, for example, there were more universities and more chance for the working class to go to universities, but this was done in a way where there was no real support for them to stay in university and actually complete their courses, etc. And there are actually, with this, there were actual attacks against the working class. So in the first years of his presidency, in his first term, there was already a pension reform made, which was a brutal attack at the time on the working class. It actually led to the split and the formation of the PSOE party at the time, and also it's also true that he did do some efforts to reduce deforestation at the time, and deforestation did begin to reduce within his government. But at the same time, he also invested and helped establish the agribusiness, especially with monoculture plantations, huge monoculture plantations that devastated other parts of the Brazilian ecosystem, and were the basis actually for Bolsonaro afterwards, part of the Bolsonaro base years later, and it's something that he's always talked about it. So it was always something that he boasted about, even that banks were never able to make so much profits as they did during his time. So there was a clear attempt at this conciliation of the system, which didn't, or conciliation of the classes, which didn't actually challenge the capitalist system whatsoever. He just brought over ideas from previous right-wing governments, and did at the same time some of the social reforms, very limited social reforms, that at the time helped people, but were not sufficient to take the majority of people really out of poverty or really have a better living standard. This he was able to do in the 2000s because of the commodity boom at the time, before the great crash of 2007, 2008, which hit Brazil a little later. And this situation won't repeat itself. He's not in the same, the world isn't in the same economic situation as it was back then. So he's now, during the campaign, he's had some rhetoric on helping the poorest, on being the supposedly most environmentally friendly government, even talking about opening a ministry for indigenous people, combating racism. But there's no concrete proposals really of how he's going to do this and where the money is going to come from this. And we've already seen during his campaign and the idea of this very broad front that was established, especially in the second round, with figures from the right wing, even some of the figures that participated in the coup against Dilma in 2016, being brought in to the campaign. His vice president is a notorious right wing. Is an ex right wing governor of São Paulo for many years, and did many attacks against teachers, the working class, and expanded the police, for example. And he's the vice president, so we've seen that he's going to be more pressured by the right wing to conciliate even more. He's already said that this is not going to be a PT government. It's going to be a broad front government. And we saw elements of program being thrown away. So most emblematic being the question of abortion, which he basically threw under the bus, starting the campaign talking about how it's an issue, it's a health issue, but then totally turning around because of pressure from the right and from the far right to say that he's against abortion, that his wives have never had an abortion, and really abandoning that struggle, even when women were the forefront of his of the most people who voted for him. So we see that he's going to be pressured to be brought over to the right even more, and there won't be any stability during his government because of the situation, economic situation, the world situation that we see now.
I think, hearing about this, I have to say that, I saw the first report that I got was a notification from actually Israeli media, and the way that they described it was actually ridiculous. It was like the headline was something like "Ex-prisoner Lula wins the election in Brazil." It was kind of ridiculous, and obviously shows also the kind of way that the far right support each other by supporting each other's candidates. But I want to ask specifically about Bolsonaro, because I think a lot of people who were following the elections in Brazil, one of the things that I think were the most frightening were kind of the, deja vu from Trump of kind of saying that he's not going to accept any other result. And if there's another result, then it's fake. And, we already know that he's kind of looking back fondly to the days of dictatorship. And we know what he stands for. But I was wondering if you can tell us if Bolsonaro actually presents a threat right now, and, is the talk of a coup something that he can realistically achieve?
So Bolsonaro has always had like this authoritarian rhetoric that he's used, and he's always been a big admirer of Trump and the figures around Trump. Even his son's meeting with people like Steve Bannon and other figures like this, and using some of the same language during the campaigns, but even before that, even during his presidency and even during his first campaign. So always attacking institutions, presenting himself as an outsider, even though he was a federal deputy for 30 years, but saying he was from outside the system, and always attacking parts of the institutions, even as president. So especially the media or the polling systems. I don't know how you say that, but the who do like political polls and all this. But also the Supreme Court and the actual voting system itself. So the system that we have here in Brazil, which is an electronic voting system, which is the reason why we have the results in one day, was heavily undermined during the run-up to the campaign, and then during the campaign itself, talking about possible fraud and there's no confidence in this and that things were going to happen. So this built this scenario and this sentiment, especially with his supporters, that any result that isn't Bolsonaro winning is fraudulent and it has to be challenged. And we've seen this week already with some of the with some of his supporters closing off highways, as we said before, in various points across the country, doing protests against the results, and really organizing them as a way to challenge the results and question their validity. This at the moment they aren't huge groups. The groups that closed off the roads were handfuls of groups that managed to do this. The protests were bigger, but at the same time, he's still kind of isolated within the ruling class. He doesn't really have the base in the ruling class to be able to do a full-on, like, old-style military coup or something like this. So, but something on the vein of January 6th is not ruled out whatsoever. His supporters are very mobilized at the moment. They're very questioning the results and going to the streets to question this. And if we don't have any kind of response from the left and the working class, they do have an ability to grow and to get bigger. He has some support within some of the security forces, so some of the police. We saw this especially with the federal highway police, both on Sunday with the suppression of the votes, but also their inaction to finish the roadblocks. There was a lot of comparison with social movements that close off highways as well, which are instantly stopped by the police, like in a matter of hours. And these roadblocks were allowed to happen for days. So there is some support, or at least elements of these security forces which do support him and could be mobilized. But as we see in a moment, he's still in an isolated position. I think it's something that we have to keep always look out for, be organized and properly prepared to stop this, and have no illusions on these institutions that they're going to be able to stop this. That the only real force that will be able to stop any attempt, like a coup venture or anything of the sort, is the working classes, the mobilized working class. So we have to pressure the left-wing parties, left-wing forces, the unions and social movements to actually mobilize and to actually show their strengths on the streets and show that we won't tolerate any of the like this kind of conspiratorial rhetoric that will take our rights away, our democratic rights away.
So you mentioned what happened on January 6th, and you're referring to the insurrection that Trump and his supporters, raised in the U.S. after or when he was supposed to transfer power over to Biden. And this has been, talked about a lot. Like, is this going to happen again? As of today, we saw that Bolsonaro didn't concede or, didn't say that he's going to try to remain in power, but he did, mention something of the transfer of power. So, this is still developing, and we will still see Lula won't take power officially, I think, until the 1st of New Year. So it's something that we should still pay attention to because his supporters clearly are mobilized and ready to fight back. I want to go back over to the situation in Italy, though. Eugenio, do you think that there is any reason that, we as socialists should be pessimistic about the situation, or should we expect some sort of resistance from the working class there?
I mean, as socialists, we always need to avoid pessimism. We need to see the potential that exists in all contexts for resistance and for struggle to develop. And Italy is no different. I mean, I think there are already some important indications of the development of struggle and of resistance that is developing in the country. Right after the election, for example, in over 50 cities, thousands of women and young men came into the streets to defend the right to abortion for the International Day for a safe abortion. We also had already important national demonstrations that have taken place. There were the demonstrations for the climate around the international climate strike. There was a national demonstration in Bologna with more than 30,000 people from all over Italy participating, which also was a convergence of various social movements, including parts of the trade union movement, parts of the feminist movement, and parts of the and especially the organized labor movement. And there are important dates also ahead that present the perspective of a struggle and of the development of popular resistance throughout Italy as a concrete perspective for the coming period. There is going to be a national demonstration in Naples on the 5th of November, for example, but also there will probably be important demonstrations on the 27th of November, on the 25th of November for the International Day of Elimination for the elimination of violence against women. We should consider that Italy is one of the countries in Europe with the highest rates of feminicides, with a woman being killed every 3 days in Italy by their partner or by another close kin. And there is a general strike of the grassroots trade unions that has been announced for the 2nd of December, and that is going to be an important date to start to rebuild a combative trade union resistance in Italy against the far right government of Giorgia Meloni. So there is a clear potential for resistance to develop in Italy and for struggle to develop in Italy, and there is also a real potential for young people, young working people, to organize themselves against this government, because the delegitimization of the Italian institutions and of the Italian political system is now boiling over in Italy into a profound radicalization of society. And the attacks that will be led by this government against democratic rights, against civil rights, against women's rights. They will be sparks that could at any time awaken what we call the sleeping giant of the Italian working class. So there is a real potential for struggle to develop, but there is also a real need for organization and for a perspective to be put forward on how we can develop this struggle and what we can achieve.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you are talking about this right now, because I feel like with everything that's going on, it's kind of like we had so many elections one after the other that were kind of far-right gains on the major scale. And I think it's quite frightening for a lot of people. I know that for me, it's one of these things that are kind of terrifying. So hearing, like you said, I think it's really good that you said, like, we can't be pessimistic about it. Obviously, we need to be realistic about it, but we can't be pessimistic about it. But I think what I wanted to ask is not just about Italy, but obviously also about Italy, but generally around the world, because it's not enough to just say that we oppose the far right. It's also about how tangibly we can defeat them. So I'm wondering if you can tell us kind of like what kind of program or strategy, what kind of organization do we need in order to sustainably get rid of the far right in a way that wouldn't allow them to come back into power, but they'll also kick them out right now?
Of course, there are many many things to be said on what kind of program and what kind of strategy we need. There are many things that we can do, both in Italy and internationally. We can join a union. We can organize on our workplace, on our schools, on our universities. But we need to realize that only through this kind of organization, only by starting from the ground up, can we start really building this resistance. And for this, we need a concrete program, and we need a program that is capable of pointing the way for concrete victories, but also that puts into question the wider structures that dominate our society. So what we say in Italy, for example, is that there cannot be anti-fascism without anti-capitalism, because the social questions that are at the roots of the rise of fascism or of the rise or of the far right are directly linked to the structures of the capitalist society and to the way that the ruling elite in this society extracts wealth and extracts resources from the working class and from nature. So we need to we really need to put forward an anti-capitalist perspective that doesn't but that also tackles the concrete demands and the concrete necessities of working people and young people today in Italy. Such demands, for example, for the full employment of all, for full employment and for the reduction of working hours, are key demands to this struggle. The increase in the minimum wage is a key demand in this struggle. In Italy, we don't really have a national minimum wage, for example. But also, of course, linking these demands to the various struggles that are taking place in Italy. I've mentioned the feminist struggle, I've mentioned the struggle for the climate, but there is, of course, a dynamic LGBTQI plus movement also in Italy. There is a dynamic anti-racist movement, there is the grassroots trade unions. There are many different forms of resistance that exist throughout the country, but they need to coordinate themselves and organize themselves within a wider movement around a concrete program that both deals with the specific circumstances of these layers, but also highlights the common interests that exist between all of these different struggles and how they're all linked to the struggle against the capitalist society.
So yeah, Pedro, in, the Americas, the situation is a little bit different. In the US, we have the Democratic Party who's in power. We have this Workers' Party, the PT, that's in power in Brazil. And so the far right has lost their power, yet they're still mobilized, they're still organized, and they're still having influence over policies that are affecting working class people. So in a situation where it's a little bit different, how can we fight back against the encroachment of far-right policies and the violence that they bring?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that we have to understand that even though we see parties like the Workers' Party, PT, back in power in Brazil, or other left fingers, that doesn't mean that the struggle against the far right is done, it's finished. Like we've elected them, that's fine, let's go home now. These are forces that will still be around, will still be a major factor, and will strengthen their base as an opposition to these governments in the next few years, as we saw in the United States happening with the Biden government. So, and this is especially if Lula repeats what he did, or even goes further, as we said before, than his previous governments, and tries to once again implement this policy of class conciliation, and trying to capitulate and negotiate with the right wing, with the ruling class. That will send more people away from, or that will make more people disillusioned with his government, more disillusioned with the situation. The promises he's made aren't really realistic in the world situation we see now. So we need to show a program as the socialist left. We need to present a real program of change, a real program of that points away, that first combats the misery and the suffering caused by the capitalist crisis that we're seeing now, which is affecting here. Like Brazil hasn't really recovered from the pandemic yet, and other social crises that came along with it. So we need a program that combats that first of all, combats the attacks on the environment and the environmental crisis that in Brazil is, we're seeing with the front line of these questions, but also points away, as Eugenio said, that actually breaks with this system that causes all this misery and causes all these questions. And I think we can't be complacent and think that Lula will provide everything, or these governments will provide all the solutions. That we need to be able to mobilize the working class, that we can't be scared of mobilizing the working class, as some of the left here have already even said recently. We can't be fall into the trap of thinking that if we mobilize the full force of the working class in the unions and the social movements, that we're going to be somehow doing the right the work of the right wing, of the far right, by creating conditions where they'll be able more powerful. If we do nothing, that's when they'll be able to consolidate themselves even more and come back possibly even stronger. So we need to mobilize and organize ourselves now to be prepared for any attempt in any move of the far right, to make sure that the defeat in the ballot box here is carried on to the defeat on the streets, in the workplaces, in the places, education, and in the boroughs, etc., and be able to actually finish the job and get rid of the far right completely. So I think the main question that we have to think about is this mobilization and organization, or our own organization prepared to confront this on the streets.
Yeah, I think that, what you're saying is so important, because as we are seeing around the world, even the places did manage to get rid of the far right have this resurgence. So it's so important not just, take down the far right, but also make sure that it's a sustainable kind of resistance to it that can, in the long run, also get rid of it. So I want to say thank you to both of you, Pedro and Eugenio, for coming here today. I think this was a really interesting episode about something that I think is terrifying a lot of people. So it's always good to hear what the situation is, hear our analysis, but also kind of hear how we can get out of the situation. So thank you so much for being on the show. And now we are going to go into the shout of the week. And this week we're going to highlight a demonstration that happened in Ireland. So in Dublin, we had a demonstration called by Rosa International to mark the 10th anniversary of the tragic death of Savita Anapanova, who was denied an abortion 10 years ago and died because of that. And this was a pivotal moment in the feminist movement in Ireland and in the abortion rights struggle there as well. This was basically what sparked this anger that eventually led to the successful referendum and to the victorious abortion struggle in 2018. And in that referendum, the Socialist Party, which is the International Socialist Alternative in Ireland, and also Rosa, which is the socialist feminist wing, played a central role in winning this amazing victory of 12 weeks on demand, of abortion for 12 weeks on demand, and also free, which is really incredible. And in this demonstration that happened very recently, there were about 1,000 people who marched in Dublin to commemorate Savita's life, but also to kind of point towards this continuation of the fight against inequality and the fight and the fight against oppression, but also obviously for bodily autonomy, because that struggle hasn't ended, for proper healthcare, for a separation of church and state, and struggle against all forms of sexism. So it's really exciting to see this turnout for demonstration in Dublin, and sending the shout out of the week today to everyone who marched in that march, and obviously for anyone who is fighting and struggling right now for abortion rights worldwide, to look at the victories that were won in Ireland and gain inspiration from them. So that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do, and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!